Welcome to Life Picks Relationships, helping you understand and enliven your marriage through the various perspectives and experiences of others who found a way to prioritize what's really important in life. From new love to those that have weathered the storms, let's get ready to take your relationships to the next level with your host, ST.
Hey, Life Picksers, hope you're having an awesome day. Are you ready to better understand yourself, your partner, and your marriage? I know today you really will. As you read in the title, we're talking about breaking the cycle of emotional pain. I'm super excited to be doing this episode. Remember, if you enjoyed this episode, share with your family and friends so they too can learn how to break the cycle of emotional pain. And you'll be helping us reach our goal of 1 million downloads per episode. So let us do this. Today's guest is a best-selling author, public speaker, workshop facilitator, and life coach. Works with people one-on-one, and she has online courses for those who can't really go and work it by themselves. Some of you, it just may be a really good idea. You can go and find out more about her at www.joyceschafers.com. Her links will be in the show notes. Thank you so much, Joyce, for being here. I am super excited to be speaking with you. You want to start by telling us how you met your husband?
Oh, I wasn't expecting that question. Yeah, sure. So my husband, I met online. So after I'd been divorced for about 5 years, kind of really getting my life together, understanding, I had this pattern of failed relationships. And when my ex-husband left me, I realized, what, I'm the common denominator in this pattern of failed relationships. So I spent a good 5 years really dealing with what I call my broken bits, the parts of me that perpetuated this pattern of failed relationships. So in that 5-year period, I developed a counseling model, which I use today. But really, I spent that time working on me. And I think that was crucial in putting me in a position of meeting someone as amazing as my husband is, because I really worked at the parts in me that made it so I wasn't choosing the right kind of people. So we met online, and right away I could tell that he was going to be perfect for me. And it turns out he was. So
now you've done all that work, and were you like certain that you're not going to bring over those bad behaviors or patterns or your old self into your new relationship? Or were you still worried about it?
See, I had gotten to the point that it simply was not an option to have that cycle perpetuate. So I had a pattern, right? 3 failed relationships, all with alcoholic men, all with them leaving me for other women. So I got to the point where I was no longer worried about it, because I really did recognize that I dealt with the root issue that was fueling that pattern in the first place. So no, I felt, quite confident, but of course, getting into a new relationship, there's always those triggers, those things that come up that, sometimes we pull our past into the present relationships, and that kind of has a way of, making things difficult. But even though that was happening from time to time, I really did feel equipped to deal with all of the triggers, all of these things where, the past has a way of seeping into the relationship. So no, by the time I'd met my husband, his name's Ron, I felt really confident. I felt like I had really gotten myself on an excellent foundation in terms of being emotionally prepared to be in a healthy relationship. So, yeah.
You didn't just put on a Band-Aid and okay, now I know how to use so-called these terms or say these things, so now my relationship's going to go well. You really went deep inside to the core of it, so it affects everything else. So if someone has a not such good emotional cycle that they're stuck in. Now, most listeners here, thank God, are not in relationships with people that have alcohol issues. They're people with good relationships that they really want to just go and make it even better. And so what would you tell someone how to identify those emotional cycles? And then afterwards, we'll get into how they could break it.
Yeah. So the emotional cycle. So my counseling model is called the cycle of emotional pain. actually. And the idea is that our childhood traumas create emotional pain. And typically, because these things happen in childhood and because typically the traumas occur in our home, so with our parents often, and again, we have to keep in mind the word trauma, right? There's a big spectrum in terms of the impact of trauma. So on one side, some people think of lock a kid in the basement and don't feed and clothe them. Of course, that is trauma, but also the spectrum includes on the opposite end, even feeling emotionally disconnected from a parent. So I think people have to become more aware. And my experience now is that I guess I haven't really met someone who hasn't experienced trauma. Yeah. So we have to start there and recognize that. So trauma is something that creates emotional pain for a child, and that child has never had the assistance to work through it. And in fact, what happens with people is that their traumatic situations become normalized, right? It's normal. So often they can live in traumatic situations, but not see it as traumatic. And so therefore not recognize that that situation may have impacted them in a really negative way. So there's lots of blind spots in relationships. So we get together in these relationships and we think this is amazing. And then all of a sudden, what happens is there starts to be triggers. So the behavior of one person will start evoking an intense emotional response in the other. And typically their response to that is then triggersome of the first person. So you have this, what I call, it's an attack, defend kind of dynamic. It's kind of like that firecracker effect, right? Boom here and boom there. And next thing you know, conversations are spiraling out of control. So most people think that what's needed at that time is to improve their communication. But really, of course, we can all stand to improve our communication. So there's nothing wrong with that. However, unless you're dealing with those emotional root issues that are causing the communication to break down in the first place, all the effective communication skills in the world is not going to cut it. It really isn't. And I've worked with some skilled communicators and myself, I feel like I'm a good communicator. However, when I'm triggered or when my clients are triggered, it's almost like throwing your brain out the window because there's that intense emotional response.
Yeah, your emotions overtake your body. Yeah.
Yeah. So when couples, they get into these relationships, what's happening when things get rocky is that there usually are triggers. So a trigger is something that mimics childhood trauma. So I worked with a guy who was harshly criticized by his dad constantly. Okay. So now when he was in his relationship, so this is a couple that came to me for help, he had no idea that criticism, so when he was criticized today as a grown man, he had no idea just how triggersome that was. He knew how triggersome it was because he would get an intense emotional response. But he didn't realize it was linked to the childhood trauma stuff, right? So when you're not aware that that's what's going on, and I would say every couple that has these hot topics, these things they fight about, and the hot topics are like these things they fight about, but they're never able to resolve. So they keep cycling through, whether it's sex and intimacy, whether it's fighting about money, whatever it is, right? Helping around the house, these hot topics that keep cycling around, it's a really, really good sign that there's a trauma piece playing out. So usually, though, a person's solution is to focus on communication, but that doesn't work. You have to dig. Yeah, I always say you got to grab a big shovel and start digging and really get to the emotional root that's fueling those hot topics. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I always say that before communication comes self-awareness, because you're not going to get anywhere before you're self-aware of what's going on here. How am I meant to be dealing with this? Why am I being triggered like that? What I can do about it. Now, identifying the hot topics, like what we always fight about, is easy for most couples. But why we fight about those things, what is the thing that is causing it, is much harder. So how could they go and do that?
So again, you're right about the self-awareness piece, right? So my approach when I'm working with couples is to first identify what I call the backstory. So what is the trauma from the childhood? What is the childhood trauma? And then what's the emotional pain that it created? So having that awareness is really empowering. So again, that example, when when we discussed his childhood trauma, that fellow I was mentioning, well, we understood that his dad criticized him negatively consistently. Again, it's not like lock the kid in the basement kind of trauma, but it was still something that created emotional pain.
Yeah, and I'm going to guess that his dad was growing up that way. One of his parents did that to him.
For sure. It's a cycle, right? So so we first have to identify the backstory. So what's the trauma and what's the emotional pain? Now, this is where it can be tricky because I've worked with so many people who don't view their childhood as traumatic. However, when you start talking about it, there's all kinds of things like abandonment, feeling, many parents are often, what I've noticed a lot here in my community anyway, is that, and we're talking more old school, but the men of the family often have to work away from home. So no one would think of that as traumatic, right? But if you dig a little deeper, you'll start to see that a child in a home where the parent is always working, that absolutely does create emotional pain. It resembles abandonment. Okay, now abandonment can look
also a strong word.
Well, and often we think abandonment is, a couple gets divorced and one parent just disappears. And of course that's abandonment, but abandonment can even just be a parent that's emotionally checked out, or a parent who's like working, constantly. So many people have a difficult time looking at their childhood and thinking that there's trauma in it. Although some people, obviously, it's easier to identify because it's more severe. But that's the first part, is identify the trauma. And so
do you have like specific questions or specific trains of thoughts for people to go and identify those traumas?
Yeah. So usually I just start, one of the first questions is asking, what their parents' relationship was like. And often, at first they'll say, yeah, it was good, but you dig around a little bit and you ask them, well, were they emotionally connected? And it's like, well, no, I never really saw them say, I love you much, or there was not a lot of, emotional connect or, affection. And then you ask things like, well, was there any kind of volatility? Like when they fought, what did that look like? Or often if there's addictions, right? Having a parent or both parents in the home that are addicted to something is an intense trauma for children. So it's just kind of really asking, like, what was it like for you as a kid? Like, what are the circumstances? How did you feel in some of these situations? So it's just active questioning. One thing I do have is a workbook. It's called End the Arguing. And I actually walk people through all of those steps that would help them identify their backstory. And then it jumps to the solutions, right? So it's just active questioning, like, what was it like for you as a kid, with that intent to kind of expose whatever traumas there might be. And then
I think that's especially like when we get older, then we're like, yeah, but they had to work, or that they couldn't control that. And we had to come up with those reasonings to deal with the trauma that came up. And that's okay for the moment when you have to go and deal with it. But when you really want to go and understand the trauma, go back to when you were 5, 6, 7, 8. And how did you feel then? Yeah.
And what you're describing there, I call that the adult rationally thinking mind, right? It's like we think through it rationally and say, yeah, well, they did the best they could. And certainly they did. Most parents do, right? But we have to be careful when we're doing that, because that can often, and I see it every day in my office working with people, that kind of adult rationally thinking mind can be quite dismissive to the childhood experience. Right. So it's like saying, well, I shouldn't feel bad that I miss my mom or dad because they're working all the time, because they're putting food on the table. Right. So kids are often, their feelings are often dismissed. And so when you discuss that, like adult rationally thinking mind, there's another dismissal often. So we have to be careful about that. Of course, we want to look at our parents with compassion, understanding, and even take it all the way to forgiveness. But we have to make sure we're not dismissing our childhood experience, because then we're not dealing with that emotional pain.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a contradiction.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So once you identify what those traumas are and what is coming up, how do we go and solve it?
So one of the most powerful things that I use is the problems in relationships, okay, which is kind of fascinating because most people look at the problems in their relationship and they think, you know what, we haven't been able to resolve this, so maybe you're just not right for me. So they use it as reasons to leave. Now, my perspective, and certainly I would never support like abusive relationships and anything like that. So if there's any of that going on, then yes, I think the solution is to leave.
Help now. Yeah.
Yeah. However, what I'm talking about is that idea of what I do is I use the problems in the relationship to get clear about myself. Okay. And that's where, and I call it one of the most powerful strategies I use is called managing triggers. So when I'm working with couples, again, they have these hot topics and the idea is your behavior is really problematic and it needs to stop so I can feel better. Now, there's nothing. So if there are unhealthy behaviors, absolutely those need to stop. Right. So, however, what I do is I take it that step further and say, okay, hang on. The behavior may or may not need to stop. So if there's name calling, say, yes, that's a behavior that needs to be stopped. That's not a healthy behavior in relationships. However, if it evokes an intense emotional response in me, then what I ask my couples to do is use those triggersome moments, okay, to switch the focus from them out there and focus on myself and my broken bits and say, okay, so what is this behavior evoking in me? And is it or is it not a trauma trigger? Does this behavior, so like criticism, right? In that example, when the wife was criticizing the husband, it was a significant trigger for him. Okay. So it's about recognizing, I see every time she, criticizes me, that's an intense emotional response. So it's about withdrawing the focus from the criticism from the other person and getting curious and say, okay, why is this so intensely problematic for me? And is it a trigger? Is it something that mimics my childhood trauma? And if so, then what's happening is that emotional pain is evoked. Okay. So that couple I was telling you about, that fellow, every time his wife would criticize him, mimic the childhood trauma, but also it evoked that deep sense of inadequacy in him. Okay. So now instead of putting the focus out there, you stop, you need to stop, it's about saying, wow, am I ever feeling inadequate? So now I need to deal with that. Now I need to recognize, okay, well, if I'm late for dinner, does that really need to mean I'm inadequate? Or do you see? Because that's what's happening. She would criticize him about being home late for dinner. He was making it mean, he was assigning his story on top of that incident, making it mean he was inadequate.
He's putting in his own meaning to it. Yeah. And
yes.
The same thing could happen in a different relationship and it won't mean something completely different because they put in a different meaning to that. Now, how does a person know about if the trigger is coming from an emotional place or from a trauma or from something else?
Yeah. So usually it's an intense emotional response. Okay. So sometimes, like if someone cuts me off in traffic, that's frustrating, but it's not going to necessarily evoke an intense emotional response. However, I have worked with people where being cut off in traffic is a trigger because it resembles disrespect. Okay. This person was abused to a great degree as a child. So anything that resembles even disrespect to him was a trigger. Do you see? So it's not the incidents because that doesn't tell us anything. It's the emotional intensity that it evokes within us that tells us if this is a trigger or not. And then, of course, if you're aware of your backstory, like what's my trauma, right, then you start to see, okay, if abandonment is your trauma, then, anything related to, someone not supporting you or someone like breaking up with you or someone, not answering the phone when you need them to, right? That could potentially be a trigger that would evoke that abandonment fear and the inadequacy and the rejection and everything that goes along with abandonment, right? So we need to really be self-reflective and identify like, what is that childhood trauma? What's the emotional pain that it evokes? And then when we do that, like whether I'm working with people in person or through the workbook, then the next step is to, now we need to identify all of the things that trigger us. So what are all of our triggers, and why that's so hugely important is because it really equips us, right? I always say it's a difference between, like, say you're standing on a train track and you don't see a train coming and it totally just bowls you over. Okay. Or versus I'm on the train track, I hear a train, I see it, I'm going to hop off, I'm going to let it go by. That's the difference between knowing what our triggers are and knowing how to manage them versus having no idea what our triggers are and then having them just derail us.
Yeah.
And then we don't know what to do about it, right? We just like, why am I so mad? And people are looking at you like, why are you so mad? Like, right? Because they're not knowing the parallels. Does that make sense?
So what do we do once we understand our triggers? Like we make a whole list of them, speak about them with your partner. Like, what's the best way to go about that?
100%. It is absolutely to make a list of them. All of the ones that you can think. And the cool thing
probably keeps on adding, like you'll think of more things over time, probably.
Yes.
No?
Yeah, but it is going to have a theme, right?
Yeah, that's for sure. Because it's coming from the same place.
Yeah. So anything related to abandonment or anything related to, a lot of people who are raised in a home where there's an addiction, those people have lots of anxiety and lots of fears. And so any triggers for them are going to evoke, like that fear response. So it gets like, once you have your mind focused on that, it gets easier and easier to identify the things that are the triggers, right? So it is definitely comes back to, like you said, that awareness part. Yeah.
Yeah. Now you could be aware of a trigger, but that person could still go and trigger you, could still go and say something about it. Now, how are you going to go and deal in the actual situation? Going back to that couple, that criticism, she could try her best. You're going to talk to her and tell her not to go and criticize, but I'm sure things happen and she'll still criticize him. What could he do in that moment when he's being triggered?
Yeah. So what I did with that couple is I worked on her with her delivery. Okay. Because she was quite, I wouldn't say aggressive. She more on the aggressive side. So she had to, I always talk about being passive, being aggressive, or being assertive. So in terms of the communication, we do want to deliver criticism as effectively as possible. So she was using a lot of you statements like, you're always late for supper, you're inconsiderate, you're not thoughtful. So those you statements are always going to evoke usually some defensiveness. So I helped her work on her delivery in terms of getting her to identify, like, how was she feeling when that happened? So she felt disrespected, she felt unheard, and using that in an I statement instead. So I felt, disrespected or hurt when you came home 5 times this week late for dinner, right? Okay. So delivery, we do have to, that kind of goes under the communication umbrella, right? So we want to,
but it comes after you know what it is. You're not just going and playing around random tools, it's doing specifically for you.
Right. And so for her, knowing then that anytime she gave him feedback, it was really threatening for him, then that was huge information and awareness for her, right? That really helped with her delivery. So that's important. It's important to discuss all of these things with your spouse or partner. So then on his side, when he was, again, because we'd worked through him identifying triggers, well, then what he was aware of is like, okay, now he knows that anytime, his wife or someone at work for that matter gave him feedback, he was like ready for it. Like, I'm off, I'm stepping off that train track. I see it coming. So now he knows. Then he got to that point where he knew every time he was criticized, it was going to evoke that intense emotional response. So then the focus is inward, right? Oh, I see I'm being triggered. Is it possible I'm triggered? Yes. Well, she's criticizing me. That lines up with my trauma. Okay. That's one step. Then we identify the emotion. is it possible I'm feeling inadequate, right? Well, this process takes the guesswork out for people. When you take that time to identify the backstory, you're not sitting there going, what the heck's going on with me? Why am I so upset? Like, right? So identify the trigger, identify the emotion, which is the inadequacy. You also want to validate the emotion. You don't ever want to skip over it. And that's a big thing that people do, right? When it's linked to our trauma pain, most people don't want to look at it. It's like squirm away, run away from it. But in order to, that saying, what you resist persists. So you must sit in it. And I call it swim in it, like swim in the swamp of the emotion. Okay. So identify it, feel it, validate it. It makes sense that I would feel inadequate because I'm criticized given my childhood. Okay. So validate it, feel it. Then really important next step. This is a solution part. You question the truth of it. Is it true that I'm inadequate if I'm late for dinner? Well, no, what's true is you're late for dinner. Okay. But what we do when we're triggered, like I said earlier, is we're assigning all that extra meaning to that one behavior. I'm inadequate. Okay. But that's not really true. Is it a behavior that you have to tweak? Yes, because it's not healthy behavior. It falls under the unhealthy, harmful behaviors. But do you need to take it all the way to I'm inadequate? Well, the answer will always be no. It's not true that you're inadequate. The truth is you made a mistake, right? So what's happening in that moment, and this is crucial, is that we are believing our story, okay? I always say trauma sends a message to the child. What's the message? Well, his message was, I'm no good. I'm inadequate. I'm never good enough. Okay. That's the story he was believing, not on a conscious level. He didn't know he wasn't consciously aware of that belief, but it was absolutely there. So what's happening is the child has believed a story about themselves. Okay. Hook, line, and sinker. They've gobbled it up whole. And what's happening is we drag our stories with us. It's like imagining a heavy sack of hammers that you're dragging around with you everywhere you go, right? Is this deep sense of inadequacy that this fellow held. So when he, became aware, so when we're managing a trigger, we have to recognize, I'm believing my old story. I'm believing my old story here. And is it true? And it's never true. It's always a lie. Because the truth is, that little boy was fine. He was being a kid. Yeah. He was supposed to make mistakes, right? But the truth was his dad didn't know how to parent him very well. Okay. Yeah. But the truth was he was supposed to make mistakes. He was fine. He was a kid learning. So when we're triggered, we have to identify fact from fiction, truth from a lie. The lie is I'm inadequate. The truth is I make mistakes. I'm not perfect. But I'm not inadequate. I'm a good person. I'm doing my best. And you see, when you understand emotions, you understand that emotions follow thoughts. It's like math. 1 + 1 = 2. Negative thoughts, I suck, I'm incompetent, I'm not good enough. Those thoughts will always lead to that swamp of emotion, right? That inadequacy we're just using that as an example, but there could be lots.
I think it's flipped. You get the emotion and then you have the thoughts.
Well, I think it can be either. I think it can be either. So I think something will happen that will trigger the emotion, but then you're perpetuating it with the thoughts. I think.
Right. What are you translating the emotion into?
Right. So when you look at managing the trigger, so when we're in the solution phase, we have to now replace the old story, right?
Yeah.
With a new one, with the truth. And that thought system will lead to a better feeling emotion if you're intentional. It has to be intentional because when I was in my 20s, I was I'm going to do affirmations and it really, really sucked for me. It never worked. And I finally figured out the reason is that it was just intellectual. It was just thoughts rolling around in my head. When we focus those thoughts with the goal of feeling differently emotionally, then there's the measure of success, right? So when you are successfully managing a trigger, you're ditching the old story, you're picking up a new one. So the thoughts are positive, but the measure of success is, am I actually feeling better? That has to be the end measure, the end goal. So whatever you're putting in your mind, if that's not working, you need to revisit it. Like, what thought process is going to help you switch from that swamp of emotion of, say, inadequacy to like feeling comfortable with yourself. Yeah. Okay. So, and I always say this is a really good trick. I'll let you in on a trick. I always say, what did you need to hear as a child? Okay. What would you have wanted your mom or dad? So in this case, the fellow's case, what did he need to hear from his dad? It's like, you're a good boy. You know, you're really good at these things, or it's okay that you made a mistake, or making a mistake doesn't make you a bad person or mean you're inadequate. So whatever, so two things. What did I need to hear emotionally as a kid is exactly the thing I need to tell myself in that moment. Okay. When you connect to that, like deeply, it's completely life-changing.
You're reparenting your child. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, that is exactly what's happening there. And the other good thing, when I get to work with parents, I love it, because the other thing, the question I ask them is, what would you say to your child if they were exactly in the same situation? Okay. And they always find the words instantly. It's
much easier when it's not you.
Right. And the thing is, when we have that childhood, so the trauma created the emotional pain. So what I've noticed with parents is that they want so desperately for their child to have what they didn't have. Okay. So if it's not, so always say if there is alcoholism in the home, that child was feeling unsafe. 100% of the time when I ask a client, what do you most want for your child? Their answer is to feel safe. Okay. That's not a coincidence. That's not an accident. That's the key. Okay. And what I find, which is so cool, is that these people it's almost like it's their superpower in terms of directing it to others. So I see these parents who want their child to feel safe. They are amazing at doing that. Okay. It's like it's a superpower. Yeah. The problem is, which is really positive, right? Because it's like you don't have to figure out, how do I do this? You know how to do it. You're doing it for your child every day. And that's amazing. What they do need to do is direct that same kind of love and support and attention on themselves, which is the part that they haven't been able to do. Right.
Yeah. And I think that when they do it on themselves, they'll be an even better parent, be able to do it even better to their own children.
100%. Right. Because the truth is, you can't really give people what you don't have.
Yeah.
So, and I'm always talking in empty cup in terms of full cup. Mm-hmm. You know, as an empty cup, when I'm thinking about my counseling model, as an empty cup, so that fellow really did feel inadequate. That was him as an empty cup and swimming in that swamp of inadequacy. That's what him as an empty cup looks like. Him as a full cup is like debunking that old story, replacing it with a new one to the point where he actually feels it, right? That's key. It just can't be words. It can't be
brain. Yeah.
it's only in part an intellectual experience, right? It has to be an emotional one. So when you get that to that point where they really get that and practice managing triggers with that goal of resetting emotionally, that's where the gold is. And the cool thing about this process is that most of us are triggered multiple times in a day and even more than one area. Now, that can be really frustrating, but from my side, it's like, man, let's use it. Let's use all these triggers to do two things. Okay. So when we're using our triggers to reset emotionally, we're actually healing our old trauma.
Yes.
But also we're making our relationship better because we're now moving from an empty cup that needs to be filled up, right, to a full cup. It's like, I'm good. I feel comfortable with who I am. I love myself. So therefore I have it to extend. Okay. Mm-hmm. So you have two empty cups in a relationship, not a pretty thing. They're fighting to be filled up, right? Fight to meet my emotional needs for me. Mm-hmm. Two people as a full cup, that's a beautiful place to get to, because it says, I'm good. Like, I love you. I want you in my life, but I don't need you emotionally. I'm good. I've got that under control. I've met my own emotional needs, and therefore I'm a full cup and I have all of that to extend. Okay. So that's what's going on when people are fighting in these hot topics. They're two empty cups fighting to be filled up by the other person. Never going to work. No. Never.
No, not at all.
Right.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that was really clear. And I think people could really go now and identify their traumas, realize why they're keep on having these fights, and could actually go and solve them. Mm-hmm. For our very last question, how would you describe an extraordinary relationship without using love, connection, or trust?
I think it's self-awareness. I think it really is. It's, and meeting your own emotional needs. I think when we do that, that puts us in that full cup foundation. So to me, it all comes down to that self-awareness. Why am I the way I am? Answer those questions, work on the emotional part. And again, it's the two parts. The awareness part in of itself only goes so far, right? So like for me, my mommy issues is what caused me to choose bad boys. Okay, having the awareness was great, but actually dealing with it so that my pattern could break, I mean, that's where the work.
That's the work. Yeah. That's the hard part.
Right.
Yeah. And it's in that space that I think it's the hardest. It's because like when you don't know, either you're in denial or like you're not thinking about it and these things are just happening and like, okay, fine. Life is hard. You're in these bad relationships, but okay. When you do know and you're like, but how do I do this? Right. That is hard. It's a hard place, but if you're aware and you're at that point, you're not going back anymore. You're just going to go and you're going to find a way. Life is just going to be better afterwards.
Well, and I really think it does come down to managing those triggers, right? That is when you say, it's like, how do I deal with my past? Every trigger is an opportunity to say no to the story, to pick up the new story and live a completely opposite emotional experience, right? And that to me, if there's one thing we can control in life is our emotional responses to things. And truly, there's everything else we like to think we have control over. But in reality, so many people say in an instant life can be different and change, right? We have very little control over life, but we do have control over our emotional responses to things. So if your focus is on identifying the triggers, and then more importantly, knowing how to manage those triggers, drop the old story, pick up the new one, get out of that swamp of icky emotion to that better feeling place, then you're on that full cup foundation and you're functioning, you're launching out into your world from that place. That's amazing. That's power. That's life-changing.
Oh yeah. I love that so much. Thank you so much, Joyce, for being here. It was so much fun to speak with you. And I know that listeners are going to change their lives because of this.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate you having me on your show.
That's all for this episode of Life Picks Relationships. And we have a huge favor to ask of you that will not only support this show, but also give others what they need to take their marriage to the next level. We're striving to have 1 million downloads per episode by December 31st, 2025. So please share it with your family and friends so they can turn their relationship into an extraordinary one.